In this lesson, we'll set up the subsurface shading materials on the squid's tongue. Alright, so picking up where we left off in our previous lesson, we now have the subsurface scattering effect that's been applied to the squid's body. Now you can see at this point that there is still quite a bit of noise overall that is contained in this subsurface scattering map. Now this can probably be fixed by starting to increase the samples of the actual render and start to increase the samples in the light map itself. Both of these things will start to increase our render time, so again, as I've said a few times until this point, I'm just going to leave these as they are, just so we can keep our render times nice and fast. So let's start to apply the subsurface scattering effect on the tongue as well. So let's go over back to the mental ray nodes, and for this one, I'm just going to use the subsurface fast shader. So there we go. And it'll ask us if we want to use the existing light map or make a new one. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and create a new light map, so that way we can write unique light map data onto this particular shader. Alright, so we'll take this, middle click, and connect this up to our tongue. And here in the viewport, I do still have the two-sided lighting disabled. So the fact that we can see the tongue and it's not just completely black means that the normals are facing outward, as they should. So let's take a look at this fast shader, and let's just see what we get right now with an initial render. So we can save this for comparison if we want to. So you can see how we do start to get a little bit of this backscattering that appears on the tongue, as far as the light that's able to pass all the way through this surface, and also we start to get a little bit of forward scattering in here as well. Now for the actual coloring of this tongue, I want this to be sort of a purple, sort of a reddish color, something of very, very deep maroon, you could say. So let's see if we can't start to use some of the different front and back scattering and diffuse colors to start to create kind of an interesting mix. So let's start with the diffuse color, and for this we can try to pick something that's a little bit more on the plum colored side. So something that is, kind of down in this purple realm. So we can kind of start with that, something that's got a little bit of purple, a little bit of red, a little bit of blue to it. Alright, so we'll start with that. And for this front scattering color, if we want to give this a little bit more of a red appearance, we can start to kind of increase that and give that sort of a little bit of a pinkish, purplish red. And finally, for this backscattering color, I typically like this to be a very, very light color, as we've already seen with this squid's body, because typically when the light is going to pass all the way through some kind of a surface, the result should be fairly light, because the light itself should be able to inherit a little bit of that color. So let's start with kind of this purple as a base. There we go. And maybe just try something that's a little bit more on the red side, just something that's very, very faint, kind of a reddish, pinkish color. There we go. So we'll start with that. And let's see what this starts to give us. Alright, so you can start to see now how this outer diffuse color starts to give us kind of this little bit of a purplish color to the outermost portion of the tongue. With this front scattering color set to a little bit more of a red, you can see how we start to get a little bit more of the appearance of kind of these red kind of blood vessels that are underneath this purple surface. And then with the backscattering color, we really can't see much of an effect on this. So let's see if we can't maybe brighten this up a little bit. We should start to see that effect becoming fairly prominent right up in these areas. So let's start by taking the backscatter weight, and let's start to bump this up a little bit. Let's also take a look at the algorithm control. And you can see right now by default the front scattering radius and the back scattering radius are both set up pretty high. These are set to a value of 10, which means that the actual light is going to be allowed to penetrate up to 10 units through the geometry. And as you can see, each one of these Maya grids corresponds to 1 unit, so 10 units is quite a substantial length. So let's start by taking this front scatter, and let's drop this quite a ways down, something like 3, so that way that gives us roughly an area about 3 of these Maya units in height or in width that this light is able to pass through and front scatter through this tongue. With the back scatter, let's set this down even a little bit lower, something like 2, and same for the depth. Alright, so let's take a look at what that'll do for us. So if we want, we can save this for comparison and re-render. Alright, and you can see now how that will start to alter the appearance a little bit more. You can see how our backscattering effect is now limited a little bit more to these outer areas of the tongue. And likewise, we can now start to get a little bit stronger front scattering effect in here now. And just to tone this down, we can probably take this diffuse color, which is containing a little bit more of this purple effect, and start to maybe dial this down and start to get something that's a little bit more on the red side. So that way the outermost color is not quite so prominent. There we go. It's a little bit closer to what I was originally sort of going for. So now we start to get a little bit more of this red appearance that comes in from the front scattering color. But this actual top diffuse color does still provide a little bit of this purple color to the tongue. So if you compare what we had before to what we have now, you can see now we're starting to get something a little bit more that's on par with sort of a fluid-filled tongue. So now let's start to add a little bit more specular onto this so we can start to get a little bit more of a wet appearance on the tongue. So a good shader for this, because you'll notice that this fast shader actually does not come with any sort of specular components. So we can actually connect in a specular shader, and we can use the fast skin specular node for this. So let's go back over here and enable the mental ray nodes. We'll drop in the mental ray skin specular. There we go. Double click on this node and just simply middle click and connect this into the specular shader. And now you can start to see how we begin to get some specular highlights on here. Now let's go back to this specular shader. Let's go back and start to make a few minor adjustments to this. Now because we do want this specular to be fairly prominent, again because this is going to be more of a wet tongue, let's start by taking this primary weight on this first layer of specularity, and let's start to bump this up. So this first layer of specularity, if you'll notice, there are actually two specular highlights, one that's a little bit wider and one that's fairly small and tight. This first layer of specularity is actually referring to this one that's on the outside, this little softer one. So let's take this and let's take its primary shininess up to something like 10, so that way it kind of tightens this up a little bit more. Now the second layer of specularity is this one that's a little tighter. So let's really bump this up and give this a nice strong strength, and you can see how that really brings this up. And let's also take this secondary shininess and start to kind of bump this up a little bit more, something like 100, and you can see that really will tighten up this specular highlight. If I zoom in and out really quickly to force this node to refresh, or force its swatch to refresh, you can see how that really starts to give us a nice highlight on here. So now, again, just for comparison, we'll save this and re-render. Alright, excellent. Now you can start to see how we can get some of this really nice prominent specular highlight on this tongue. Now we probably will want to go back to the specular shading node, and let's make sure that any kind of reflectivity is disabled on this. So let's take a look inside the reflections. And it looks like right now the overall reflect weight is set all the way down to 0, which really is what we want. So that way we don't start to get any unnecessary reflections of any areas that we don't want. Alright, so to finish this off, let's take this tongue shader and start to connect in its normal map. So the way that we can do this is with some of these nodes, such as the fast shader, it cannot actually take a direct bump map connection. So what we would have to do is use this set normal node as a way of bridging the bump node to the actual specular shader, or the subsurface shader. So let's start by taking the set normal. And in order to connect this in, let's go over to the Maya nodes. Let's drop in our bump 2D node. This is going to be what we actually connect our bump map shader into, or our bump map texture into. And finally, we'll drop in a file node. So let's go back to the image. We'll plug in the tongue normal. There we go. We'll take this and middle click, drag it up into the bump value. There we go. And we'll also make sure that this is set to be a tangent space normal map, since that's what this is. And finally, we take this bump 2D and we connect this into the normal vector of this set normal node. Alright, just like so. So kind of a little lengthy connection that we have to go through here. So you can see pretty much have 4 nodes that are kind of strung together. And then finally, we can take this set normal, plug that into the bump. There we go. And then immediately you should start to see the bump effect beginning to show up on this tongue, or on this shader itself. So now, again, save for comparison, re-render. Okay, and once that's been applied and set up, now we can start to see some of the bump mapping effect on this tongue. Again, if you compare what we have now to what we have before. So now you can just start to see a little bit more noise, a little bit more variation in the overall shading of this tongue. Alright, excellent. So now that we have this set up and we kind of have these tongue shaders in place, what we'll start to do in our next lesson is begin focusing on some of these little drool pieces of geometry and some of the shaders that we can use as far as really kind of making these look like a liquid type substance.